So, hello, welcome. This talk is called Constraint and the Art of Programming, which is a kind of fancy way of saying what we all know, really, which is that making live events happen isn't easy, almost regardless of your resources, because there are so many things that are only slightly within your control. And I'm going to talk about some of the problems and hopefully some of the solutions that I've encountered doing what I do. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about me. My name is Chris Sharp. Hello. I work at a place called the Barbican in London, which many of you probably know is a large arts centre. And my job title is Contemporary Music Programmer. And that doesn't mean that I know anything about Ableton Live or Pro Tools. It means that I construct the Barbican's contemporary music programme. In other words, our year-round programme of concerts, mostly but not exclusively taking place in the Barbican Concert Hall, which is in the City of London. The output is between 50 and 60 concerts a year, probably something like that, so it's averaging around about one a week. Sometimes these come in kind of clumps of closely related activity, and sometimes they're just kind of one-off things that happen because they seem like a good idea at the time. Apart from the fact that we close in August, and therefore I've just been on holiday, it's a year-round programme, so it runs from September all the way through to July. The bit about Barbican. My job is basically to decide what we do in that context of contemporary music. Obviously, the Barbican also has classical music, so alongside the work that I present in the concert hall, we have the classical programme, and being a multi-art centre, we also have two art galleries, two theatres, 3 cinemas, a creative learning programme, and various other things. That is all part of the output of the centre. So the work that I do also sits alongside all of that, and sometimes kind of interreacts with it and cross-fertilises with it. The Barbican itself, just to give you an idea briefly of the setup of the institution, is relatively new. By relatively, I mean it opened about just over 30 years ago, early 80s, and it was built on a bomb site from the Second World War, and it took them a very long time, clearly, to decide what to do with the bomb site, because that was created in the 40s and the building opened in the 80s. But after much discussion, the City of London, which is separate from the city, when I say the city, I'm talking city with a capital C. It means the kind of financial district in the middle of London, in case that's not clear to any of you. It's a separate authority within the city as a whole, and they have their own fundraising powers and resources and decision-making processes, and they decided they were going to build this kind of mid-20th century concrete utopia, basically, which was going to combine places to live, places to encounter culture, and to separate it out from the kind of noise of the traffic and the outside world. So it's a slightly strange place in architectural terms, but it's become a very successful institution. And one of the reasons I think it's become successful is because the money that we get to do what we do doesn't come to us from national government. So we're not funded, at least not directly, by public taxation in the same way that almost all arts organisations in the United Kingdom are. We're funded almost entirely by the city itself, which has quite a lot of autonomy in terms of its own resources and its own fundraising. And so that in turn gives us quite a lot of autonomy in terms of the artistic and administrative decisions that we can take. We're not obliged to, because we don't get, we don't get any, we do get a little bit of money from the Arts Council, which is Britain's national arts funding system. We do get a little bit of money from them, which I might touch on later, but the vast majority of money that we get comes directly from the city, and obviously from our commercial revenue, including our box office revenue, and that's the money that I use to programme. So I'm not tied into any, for example, if the government says, we're going to only let the Arts Council spend money on jazz because all other music is rubbish. We don't have to pay any attention to that because we don't get our money from the Arts Council. We're free from those kind of constraints. And that's one of the ingredients that makes our programme very interesting, I think. So that's the other thing probably to say just a little bit about the organisation that I work in is it's really quite well funded. And so we do have money to spend, less than we used to, but we do have money to spend. I have a budget to spend, so I don't have to, I'm allowed to lose money over the course of a financial year subsidising the work that I choose to present. And also, and kind of crucially, unlike lots of organisations, lots of festivals, lots of venues, we don't really have a kind of artistic figurehead. Lots of places have a kind of director of arts or a kind of mouthpiece of the organisation who often calls a lot of the shots in terms of what happens. We don't have that at all. The decision making is really devolved down to the programmers in each of the art forms. And although we have somebody who is our head of the arts department, she's an administrator and an empowering figure rather than a decision maker in terms of content. So I actually have extraordinary freedom to do, I don't have to go to anybody before I confirm a project and say, I'd like to do that, is that okay? The only thing I have to do is be myself satisfied that it's worth doing and be myself satisfied that the financial constraints financial side of it is acceptable, we can afford it, and it's going to work, and hopefully that people are going to come to it. So you might think, in this incredibly enviable situation, whereby I have control of my own budget, my own decision making, I've got this big organisation behind me, it's in London, big capital city, lots of action happening, that actually, what you might think of, what constraints, how can there possibly be any constraints? This is somebody who can literally do anything that he wants to do. And while that's sort of true theoretically, it's not true practically, and that's why I titled this discussion the way that I titled it, because I wanted to suggest to you, hopefully in ways that are a bit provocative and a bit interesting and require a bit of creative lateral thinking, that part of the job, in many ways, all of the job is actually not so much sitting around having brilliant ideas, although of course I do have brilliant ideas. It's actually solving problems and working out how you can do the things that you want to do in ways that actually make them work. Some of the constraints that you might encounter. The first one, obviously, is money. I said, and I stand by the fact that we're quite well resourced as an organisation, probably better resourced than many in our position. Our funding actually has been decreasing in recent years, in the years after the mid-2000s financial crisis. The city, in step with everyone else on the planet, has decided to spend less money on fripperies like culture and more money on, bankers. So we actually get less money than we got 5 years ago, quite a lot less, a third less money than we got 5 years ago. But we're still really quite well resourced in terms of, I have an annual budget, which is around £200,000 to present the programme. And so I can allocate that any way that I like. If I chose to do one thing that cost £200,000 and make everything else break even, I could do that. Or if I chose to spend £3,000 on 60 things, I could do that. I have the freedom to spend that money however I would like to spend it. But even though that money is quite good, some things are really, really, really expensive. There are just some artists that are very expensive. I'm thinking in particular, there's a few kind of hilarious examples of kind of celebrated world music figures, for example, who don't get out of bed for less than a very large sum of money. So, for example, there's a Lebanese singer called Fayrouz, who I'd love to present. It's well known that she doesn't sing for less than $100,000. There's a Pakistani singer called Abida Parveen who has a similar kind of price tag. It would be cool to do those people, but you have, that as soon as you agree a fee like that, it's going to cost you a lot of money to do a show. And so you have to decide Is that money that we want to spend? Equally, there are projects that are not so much kind of artist demand driven, as it were, but projects that you know are going to be super expensive. An orchestra from overseas, for example, if you want to fly even a European orchestra to London, put them up for a rehearsal period, and then present them, you're probably looking at 60 flights, 60 hotel rooms for 3 days. It can very, very quickly cost tens and tens of thousands of pounds to do something like that. So, for example, I looked at a project. I'm going to try and give you examples throughout, so it's quite interesting to tie these kind of particular challenges to actual things that I've encountered. So for example, I looked at a project with the Polish composer Zbigniew Preisner, who wrote a lot of the soundtracks for the Krzysztof Kieslowski films in the 80s. And he wanted to do a project which was commissioned by an orchestra in Wrocław, which was going to be a live performance of the film scores with screenings of the films. And by the time I'd looked into the cost of flying an orchestra from Poland and putting them up in London for a week, and it was going to cost like 60 grand to do. It's like I didn't really want to spend. It's a great project, but it's not 60 grand great project. And sometimes it's more just about the technical stuff. So this is a project I actually did in the end, and I'll talk about how in a moment. But I did a show with John Cale from the Velvet Underground a couple of years ago, just because it was too mad to turn down. He had this project that he wanted to realise, which he called a drone orchestra, whereby he was going to get these drones, flying devices, and attach a system of speakers and microphones to them, so that they could distribute the sound that he was making musically around the auditorium physically in real time, so creating a kind of changing soundscape as with the movement of the drones, but also he mic'd them up because he wanted to use the audio from the motors and the airflow as part of the texture of the music that he made. So we had this like insanely complicated sound system, like this multi-channel sound system, which involved sending audio from the drones down to the stage, and then to the mixing desk, and then to the PA, and then also similarly sending sound up from the stage to the mixing desk, and then by radio up onto the speakers that were mounted on the drones, so as they flew around the auditorium. And then on top of all of that, that's just the audio side of it, we also had to come up with a method for controlling the flight patterns of these objects so that they didn't smash into each other or the audience, and there were all kinds of issues relating to how we managed that. And what else did we have to do? There was all kinds of. It turns out one of the things about my job is you do discover interesting things. Like I discovered quite a lot during the course of that project about the payload of drones, like how much weight they could carry, depending upon, and the power requirements to carry that weight, and therefore how long they could stay in the air for. So we had to do quite a lot of mapping on, if you had a song that was going to last for like 8 minutes, there was suddenly a kind of like, well, can this drone that was carrying this sound stay in the air for 8 minutes? And so then we had to work out how we were going to take off, land them, change the battery packs, get them ready to go up again, So that's probably a bit too much detail, but it gives you an idea of how sometimes kind of there's a cool idea there that you can encapsulate in quite a brief sentence, but actually ends up having financial and technical ramifications that prove to be, quite heavy. Now we actually did that show, and that was one of the examples, I guess, of what I would say is that when you come to these kind of like really expensive things, it's a judgment call. And this is where you just have to go with your experience and your gut feeling as a programmer, as a presenter, and say, this is worth doing. It's cool enough to be worth doing. It's cool enough to be worth spending whatever it was, 50, 60,000 pounds on to do this. Now, as it happens, that particular project, the reason I was able to make it happen is we got some other funding. And so one of the things that you can end up doing from time to time in my job is you can actually be shopping around for help, financial help with projects. So there are in this case, we got some money from an organisation called The Space, which was a government, UK government, and BBC BBC Broadcasting Initiative about digital art, and they were setting up this kind of online space for digital multimedia art, and basically they gave us really quite a lot of money. I think it was about £27,000 towards the cost of that project, and in exchange we gave them a kind of an app that we developed out of the programming for the drones that gave them a kind of online manifestation of this concept, which is, I'm guessing, is still on the internet. You can probably look for it. So that turned an insanely expensive project, like a 60 grand project, into like a 30 grand project. You know, still quite a lot of money, but it made it reasonable. Also, for example, quite often I might go to cultural centres. Lots of, like in Germany, the Goethe Institute, Nehru Centre in India, PCI in Poland. There's lots of these organisations. Some are more proactive than others, and some of them are in quite surprising places. So, for example, Quebec has quite a lot of money for cultural activity, so that's why you see quite a lot of globetrotting Canadian artists out there, because Quebec is quite well set up to fund those people. I don't know if we've got any Canadians here, but you probably know that if you are. So, for example, I wanted to do a project a couple of years ago with a group called Fire Orchestra, who are completely bananas, 30-piece, mostly Swedish, but kind of pan-Scandinavian free jazz group, led by a bloke called Max Gustafsson, which I saw in a club in Stockholm, and surgically removed the back of my head, skull, you know, splattered my brains against the wall. It was just like one of those moments where you just thought, this is fucking amazing. But then it was like, I've got to get 35 free jazz musicians to London, and then you get to the whole thing where it's like, we could hire a bus, and then they'd have to drive for 3 days, and that's going to cost this, or then we have to have 30 flights. But in the end, we actually got some money from the Swedish Cultural Institute, who helped offset some of the travel costs, which made that a realistic proposition. Equally, sometimes you can find other people who are interested, you know, so part of what I do is I develop relationships with other organisations around the world, actually, you know, presenters, promoters, venues, festivals, commissioning partners, and so there's a kind of informal network, actually, of people who do the kind of thing that I do. And you'll quite often get a phone call from somebody who goes, we've got this project, we need some money. So, for example, I recently co-commissioned in Berlin, many of you know, there's a festival here called CTM, Club Transmedial, which happens here in, always feels like the dead of winter, it's kind of February. And I co-commissioned with them a project called Still Be Here, which was done at the HKV here back in February, and we're going to do it in London early next year. And that was an example of me being on the receiving end. They needed a bit of money to help make this thing work, and I gave them a bit of money and got the show, obviously, in return. I might do the same thing in reverse. I might go to somebody and say, I've got this great idea, but, you know, can you chip in 10 grand to help develop it? So you might work in partnership with a festival or another venue or something like that. So there are ways that you can deal with the money thing if you think it's something you really want to do. Other you know, constraints that you might have to consider is the room that you're going to be working in, both in sort of aesthetic terms and in technical terms and in kind of musical terms. Does it fit? So I principally work in a venue called the Barbican Hall that I mentioned earlier. It's about 2,000 capacity. It's fully seated. There's no way of taking the seats out. They're kind of bonded onto concrete. There's, you know, you'd have to, you know, get a wrecking ball in to get rid of them. It was designed for orchestras to sit and play on. Although over the years we've done quite a lot of work with the PA and with projections and with sound design and stuff like that to make it as flexible as we can make it, there are just some things that aren't going to be great in there. Either just because, I mean, you know, sort of, you know, amplified rock music, really rocky rock music, just doesn't work super well in there. It's kind of, you get a lot of mid-range. The venue's quite large, it's quite a live acoustic. You get a lot of reflections, lots of kind of mid-range clashy stuff kind of happens with stuff that's really distorted and amplified. And actually there are structural issues as well. So a few years ago I was looking at doing a project with this group Sunno, who some of you might know. They're a kind of very bassy, experimental kind of black metal group led by a bloke called Stephen O'Malley, and they had a project that they wanted to present in a kind of seated space. And I had a look at it, and we got the technical writer from them, and it said something insane like, the sound on stage is going to be 130 dB or something like that. And, I forget. It was bonkers. But we don't have a formal limit. I mean, people can be. I've had shows that are louder than that in there, and I'll perhaps talk about one later on. But in this particular case, there was an issue. This is hilarious but true. There was an issue with what was going to happen with the way that the subsonic frequencies were going to travel along the infrastructure of the venue. So I mentioned earlier we've got a theatre. The theatre's physically about 30 yards, I guess, from the concert hall, less, 20 metres, 25 metres. So there are these great big fuck-off bits of concrete that hold the whole place together. And there was an issue that our techs were really concerned with, whereby this extreme low frequency resonance was going to actually travel along the concrete, not through the air, along through the physical structure of the building and be audible in the theatre. And it just so happened that we had the Royal Shakespeare Company doing King Lear or something in the theatre at the time that we were looking at this, and there was this kind of our guys talked to the theatre guys, and we've got this rather loud show we're looking at, and they were just like, forget it, the RSC will flip if they suddenly get this kind of in the background while they're that was my Sunno impression, by the way, while they're doing King Lear. So you've got these kind of things that you would never think about, like, fuck it, do Sunno, that'd be great, but actually it turns out not that great. And I remember actually seeing Swan's rider as well. That was just another kind of insane amount of level that they required because they're all deaf. So yeah, there are those kind of limitations. And then there are kind of things like, the shape of the venue is just a flat concert platform. There's no kind of wings, there's no flying system, so you can't drop scenery or you can't drop a set in or out. Even if you want to, for instance, show a film in part of the evening and then not have the screen there in the other, you can't really do that, because in order to get the screen down you need to drop the bar down onto the stage, and while they're working on the stage you can't do a stage move, so then you have a 45-minute interval, and that messes all the timing up. There are all these kind of really boring things that actually you end up thinking about really quite a lot. Like, how do I make that work? They want to do this, but how can we do it? Is there a way to project onto something else? Is there a way to commission some other content for the screen so it's not blank in the rest of the show? These are the kind of problems that kind of really practical problems presented by what the venue can and can't do. And there are other solutions as well. And then there are just kind of, I mentioned the seats don't come out, so dance music, I like dance music, I like club music. There's a lot of artists whose work I really value in that area. Are there ways to present them? What happens when a seated audience comes into an audience for those kinds of artists comes into a seated venue and kind of sits there, and like, when is it okay to get up? Are we going to be told off if we start dancing? As it happens, people are perfectly welcome to dance if they want to dance, and we have had shows where people have just been charging all over the space, and we generally love it when that happens, because it shows that the kind of music has somehow transcended the kind of restrictions of the space. So I remember doing shows with people like Theo Parrish or Apparat, or even we did this Lebanese group called Mashru Leila, where it absolutely kicked off. They went completely crazy, and people were charging around, beer was flying everywhere. Our hosts were kind of like, what's going on here? But it was all extremely good-natured. And when I do those shows, I sit there at the back of the room just willing one person to get up. It's like, go on, you want to get, and you see it happen. One person gets up and suddenly the whole room just gets up. But you have to be a bit careful about that. You have to say, well, is it going to be sufficiently... I remember years ago I did a show with Metronomy, that really didn't work, because their audience were kind of too indie. They didn't want to get up, and they wanted to get up, and they didn't want to get up, and the singer, whose name I forget, sorry, was saying off from the stage, oh, it's a bit weird being in a seated venue, isn't it? You know, and you get in that kind of thing, and you suddenly get this feedback loop where it was like, well, they didn't really feel comfortable, and the audience didn't really feel comfortable, and it was a bit like, well, you know, fuck off a lot of you. So that went down to me as that felt like a mistake. That didn't work, you know, but there are some things I've done that have. And for example, you might decide to do some things for completely different reasons. So we've got a relationship with an entity called Just Jam, which is a kind of grime and bass culture webcast, and we did a live Just Jam show a couple of years ago with loads of kind of grime and urban music artists in little sets of DJs, MCs, exactly the kind of thing that you would think would never ever work. But it worked partially because we got a really cool young audience in who'd never been to the venue before and who were really just excited to be there and to be running around in there. And also because we did a lot of work with video as part of the show, so we were doing live video projected onto screens all over the place, and live video mixing, so they'd created all these bizarre video backdrops, and they were keystoning, you know, that when people are up against a blue background, you can cut out the background and then superimpose the performance on a pre-existing backdrop. They were doing all of that in real time. So we created a kind of really compelling visual component to the show that made the sitting down thing feel a bit less weird, you know. So again, you know, there are kind of ways to play within the constraints of the space, but there are just some things that just aren't really going to work, you know. So, sorry, I'm just going to hop over here because I've got very, very poor timekeeping, and I have a kind of loose list of things that I was going to mention, and I want to make sure I get them all in. Yeah, the other thing, I guess, is the idea of the programme that we have, and are things like a good fit with the programme. You know, we're kind of, I mean, you've probably gathered from the names that I've blithely kind of thrown in as I've been talking that we have a wide remit. We do quite a lot of different things, and the music programme that we do varies from kind of contemporary classical and jazz all the way through to kind of world music of different kinds, global music, and through kind of electronic music and singer-songwriter music and folk and all the rest of it. But there are just And so our audience, the people who are on our mailing list and who buy our tickets and who come back again and again, kind of expect to see, you know, a certain range of work. But every once in a while, you come across something and say, well, do our audience really want to see that? You know, is that something that's really going to work? So for example, this is a thing that I'm looking at the moment. Actually, there's a British DJ called Sasha. I don't know how many of you are kind of Balearic culture, but he's when I was younger, in the sort of early 90s, the sort of super club era, you know, he was like one of the biggest kind of house DJs on the planet. You know, he was almost a household name in the UK. But he's been listening to his Niels Fram and stuff, and he's got into this kind of listening music-y thing, and he wants to come and do a show with us, doing his kind of seated listening late night with Sasha type thing. And I'm really on the fence about that. I could do a little straw poll. You know, is that a good idea? Is that not a good idea? I don't know. You know, I can't work out if his audience wants to come to a place like ours and see him there. I can't work out if our audience even knows who he is. I just don't know. Sometimes there's only one way to find out with things like that, and that's to do it and see what happens. The other obvious main kind of constraint is how big an audience an artist's got. If you're in a 2,000 capacity room, ideally you want to try and sell 2,000 tickets. There may be reasons strategically why you assume you're going to sell fewer than that, but because date availability is constrained, you know, I don't have an infinite number of dates to choose from. It's a real shame to waste one of them on something that's only going to sell 400 tickets unless you have a really good reason for doing it. So I get, you know, as you can imagine, cold calls, you know, practically every day. And I'm blessed with one of those telephones that doesn't tell you who's ringing when it comes in, it just rings. So every time you pick up the phone, it's kind of Russian roulette. I always pick up the phone, of course. Quite often I just get a phone call, you know, from somebody who just says, oh, hello, I'm an artist and I'd like to come and play at the Barbican. And you go, oh, really? You know, tell me what you do. And they, bless them, truly believe that their audience will multiply from, you know, 27 to 2000 just by coming to play in a big venue, you know. All they need is that chance, you know. And unfortunately, as I'm sure you all know, the world doesn't work like that. You know, I do a lot of research, of course, into what size venues artists have played before, you know, what kind of audiences we might realistically expect. Sometimes there is a kind of Barbican bounce effect. You know, if you time it right and it's an interesting project, you can get an artist to really do way better than they have done in the past. So an example might be there's a British kind of, I don't know what you'd call them really, experimental rock group, that's a terrible way of describing them, called These New Puritans, who I think are very good, and they made a record a few years ago that was super exciting to me. I thought it was a really amazing record, and we decided to go crazy and hire an orchestra, get them to play with an orchestra and do this big show, despite the fact that I think their previous biggest show in London was to about 600 people. But we decided that the record was strong enough, the music was interesting enough to really try and make a statement. We didn't sell out, but we sold about 1,500 tickets, so they easily more than doubled their audience. But that was a combination of effects. It wasn't just me going, hey, yeah, come to the Barbican. It was because there was a kind of tide of interest that was kind of happening, and the combination of that and a really interesting way of presenting their music kind of brought a lot of floating voters in. And actually, we did another show with them a couple of years later, which really did sell out. So, you know, sometimes you kind of almost take a sort of strategic decision and say there's somebody that you kind of want to help because you just think they're a really strong, really interesting artist. And you take a bit of a risk on the audience and hope that it pays off. At the other end of the scale, there's artists who are just never going to come, however much you ask. You know, we're quite a nice venue, quite prestigious, decent size, you know, but there are people out there. Tom Waits, you know, tours every 15 years, you know, Kendrick Lamar probably wants $1 million, you know, whoever you think of, there are people who are never going to come and play at the Barbican, you know, if they come to London, they're going to do Wembley, or they're going to do, you know, an enormous place, you know. So whilst it's easy to imagine, and quite often I get pitches from kind of freelance producers who say, oh, I've got this great idea for a gig, right? What we're going to do is we're going to ring up Joni Mitchell and Tom Waits and and we're going to ask them all to come and do the songs of Harry Chapin or something. And you go, well, that's a brilliant idea, but they're not going to come, so thanks for sharing, you know. With all the best will in the world, you know, there are some things that even our powers are too limited to influence. So you sort of have to, you know, more constraints. Sometimes, again, you can find ways to get around and get to people. So maybe Tom Waits is probably not going to come and play the Barbican anytime soon, sadly. But I remember, for example, Beck released this record called Song Reader, which wasn't really a record. It was he decided to release an album as a book of sheet music, and we thought this was a cool idea. And so I got in touch with his people and said, hey, we'd really like to invite a load of different artists to come and play these songs. He can come if he wants, but, you know, just give us the blessing to do it. And they said, okay, cool, you know, do it. And we actually worked with Faber, who are his publishers, who published this book in the UK, to put together a really kind of cool list of different people who came and did it, who, of course, I can't remember any of them now, but I remember Franz Ferdinand. Sabine, can you remember who did that show? Franz Ferdinand? I can't remember. There was about 20 people. Anyway, they were all good. And then at the end, and literally like 2 weeks before the show, we had no idea if Beck was coming or not. We kept getting he was on holiday in France or something, and he was like, oh, maybe he was going to come over, and maybe he wasn't, or whatever. It was ridiculous. And we were going, okay, well, if he comes, what does he want to sing? You know, it was just insane. Anyway, we didn't even really announce him, I think. It was kind of a surprise, wasn't it? But anyway, he turned up on the day, literally, kind of came into the room kind of blinking and looking a bit stoned, and, you know, chewed the fat with the band, and then played a couple of songs, and it was great. So that was a way to get somebody kind of cool. If I'd just gone to them and said, hello, Beck, will you come and play a Beck concert at the Barbican? It wouldn't have happened, you know. But we constructed an event. He came and played it. A load of great people came. It was actually a really cool night. So there are ways that you might entice people in. Other problems. I mentioned much earlier in this kind of spiel that we share the room. You know, I don't have free reign over the diary at all. In fact, nothing like it. This is largely because in my world, the Barbican also presents a really huge classical music program. The LSO, the London Symphony Orchestra, are sort of resident orchestra. They do 70 or 80 concerts a year. Alongside that, there's other orchestras who are associates who do their season in the concert hall. Then there's a Barbican own promotions classical show, another 30 shows a year. And the planning cycles in classical music are way longer than the planning cycles in my world, you know. So these people all know what they're doing in 2018, 2019, 2020 even. So that means that there's dates in the diary which there's a line through them, forget it, the LSO are already there, you know. So quite often I'll get phone calls, hilarious phone calls from agents at the last minute saying, oh, so-and-so wants a gig, you know. What was the one? I remember a Fleet Foxes phone call that came in, you know, about 3 weeks before they wanted it, you know. It's like, have you got any dates next month for Fleet Foxes? I was like, well, no, because we haven't, you know. So we also have to share, unfortunately, the venue with our commercial department who sell the space for conferences, corporate AGMs and graduation ceremonies and things like this, and I think we lose about 60 or 70 dates a year to those kinds of things, which we really need the money. I mean, you know, those things bring in a lot of money to the organisation, but they're really inconvenient because they want the same. Nobody wants to do a corporate AGM on a Wednesday, on a Monday night in January. You know, they all want to have a Thursday in May or October or whatever, you know. So there's no way of parcelling out the dates so that they get all the rubbish ones and we get the good ones. You know, we all have to take our share of Monday nights and things like this. Really boringly, I also have to work around the orchestral rehearsal program. So quite often, a date will look like an empty date in the hall, but actually you've got an orchestra rehearsing in there in the morning, so you wouldn't get access until the afternoon. So anything you want to do that's technically complicated involves really big sound design or AV or whatever like that. It's really hard to deliver because you don't even get into the building till 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You've got to get a show up in 6 hours. It's you know, about half the dates I work with, you know, have an orchestral rehearsal sitting on them, so I have to be quite careful about how I position different projects, you know. So I try and put the technically less challenging projects on the dates where there's an orchestral rehearsal and save the other dates for the things that need more time. There's a lot of challenges. In fact, so many challenges that you might think, how do you do anything at all? But I've kind of mentioned some solutions as I've been talking, but I'll run through a few more bits, things, kind of food for thought, hopefully, and then I'll let you ask some questions if you have any. So these are my kind of 4 kind of tips for maximising your chances of presenting a programme that you're happy with and that people want to come and see. Firstly, I mentioned availability and dates. Like, you've got to guard your flexibility as much as you can, because as soon as you commit to a show, you can guarantee you're going to get a phone call the next day from somebody saying that Bob Dylan's looking for a gig in London. So a lot of what I do, and it infuriates my colleagues, is you kind of keep as many balls in play as you can until the moment comes where you have to kind of say, okay, that's going to land there, that's going to land there, that's going to land there. Preserve your flexibility, basically, and don't commit to things. I mean, there are some things you just know you want to do. It's fine. Yeah, absolutely, I want to do this. It's a real priority. Let's just do it. Let's get the date in. Let's get it nailed. Let's do it. And there are other things that are kind of, you know, that'd be cool. But there are other things that'd be cool too. Those things are the things that you try and keep in play until you're kind of forced to commit, usually by a marketing or a press release deadline. People are screaming at you you going, so what is happening next May? Secondly, kind of build space for yourself in your activity for the things that you find interesting and you want to investigate in more detail. if people out there know that you're shopping for certain kinds of work, certain projects, then things start coming to you. So, so we've had a series over a number of years, loosely about music and film, where because we have a really good projector and really good screens and stuff in the venue, we've started to explore work where moving image and music happening at the same time is a thing. So that could just be a kind of orchestra playing a soundtrack to a silent movie, or it could be something where, like the Mogwai project that some of you might have seen the other day, which is coming to us next month. You know, those kind of live soundtracks where the video component and the sound is kind of created simultaneously. I also have a series called Transcender, which is about kind of loosely about kind of devotional and kind of narcotic music around the world, which I kind of created largely because I just really like kind of trippy music, and I thought it'd be really interesting to kind of put different kinds of trippy music alongside each other. So, you know, we've got like this year we've got you know, Moroccan Nawa music alongside people like Stars of the Lid playing kind of, you know, long ambient drone music. So it was really just an excuse to kind of say, okay, well, there's this really interesting kind of music which is about taking us out of our own heads and onto an astral plane somewhere. Let's kind of find interesting ways to juxtapose music from different traditions, different places, and suggest kind of connections between them. And one thing that's worked really well for us over the last 5 or 6 years is that we've invested a lot of time and care in this kind of what is now quite a obvious sphere, which is these kind of, I mentioned Niels Fram earlier on, but people like him and Max Richter and Johan Johansson and these kind of composers who've kind of come out of, well, different areas. They might have come out of electronic music or experimental music, but who are making a kind of post-classical, ambient-y kind of listening music, which when I started presenting that in the Barbican, you know, a long time ago, 7 or 8 years ago, there weren't huge audiences for this stuff, but we felt quite strongly that that if you were going to find a bridge between kind of club and gig goers and home listening fans who were going to provide you with a new generation of people who wanted to come and sit in a concert hall and listen to music being played by real instruments. These people who were emerging, and others like them, like Nico Muhly and Bryce Dessner in the States, were going to be kind of quite a useful, strategically, I mean, leaving aside their obvious qualities as people who make interesting music, we kind of said, well, this is a thing here, and if we can get audiences for this, these people are going to keep coming potentially for decades into the future, so that when all the people who are coming to listen to the LSO die, because that is going to happen, there are still audiences who want to come to the Barbican Centre. So we made a conscious decision to find space for these people in the programme, and the audience has really grown to the extent that Niels curated a festival for us a couple of months ago, you know, and his own show within that sold out in seconds, you know. So we've been part of the emergence of him and people like them over the years. The other thing I would suggest is think laterally. I'm obviously tied to a venue, and the perspective that I'm talking to you from is from the perspective of somebody in an arts organisation, but I think it's really important to kind of not be hidebound in the way you think about how you do stuff. So again, a number of years ago now, we took the decision, which seemed really weird at the time, to start presenting concerts not in the Barbican. And it was a really kind of pragmatic and self-interested decision at first, where we kind of said, well, look, there's artists who we like, who we think are interesting, who we think are going to go on to become significant. We can't put them in the concert hall for all kinds of reasons. Maybe they're doing site-specific work, or maybe people need to move around. They can't be sitting, you know, statically in one place for an evening, or maybe their just audience isn't big enough yet. You know, maybe we think they will be filling the Barbican Hall in 2 years' time, but they're not now. But we want to develop that relationship. So we started just developing relationships with venues around London and putting work in there. And at first, you kind of thought, how weird is that? You know, how can it be a Barbican show when it's not in the Barbican? And we agonised a bit about how audiences would react to that and how you'd communicate it and say, no, you don't come to the Barbican, you go to Hackney. But actually, audiences were not the problem at all. It was they're used to going to events promoted by people that happen in different venues. If you think about you know, you just look at where the venue is. Sometimes you don't even look at the promoter at all, you know. So actually it turned out to be surprisingly straightforward to go and work in different spaces around London. And now we have a whole cross-arts series called Beyond Barbican, where not just us in music, but the other art forms also present work around East London mostly. And that's linked to our creative learning work, and it brings in funding. So it's actually turned what seemed like a kind of whimsical decision has turned into like a really quite a key strand of what we do. So that's just an example of thinking laterally. The fourth thing I would say is collaborate. I mentioned earlier that I talk to lots of people in other venues and other festivals. Those are ways, you know, of kind of sharing expenses, sharing costs, sharing resources, and sharing ideas and contacts as well. But it doesn't just have to be internationally. You know, promoters and producers in London come to me quite often with ideas that perhaps are just reaching beyond their ability to deliver, and they need some help. But we could share some risk, share some resource. We also have the great opportunity within the Barbican of collaborating with our partners in other art forms. So I might work with the Art Gallery. They did a big thing last year with an artist called Doug Aitken called Station to Station, where he kind of curated 30 days of activity, and I was quite closely involved with talking to him about music work that he wanted to bring into that context. So suddenly I was able to put music into the art galleries, you know, invite people to come, and we built a little recording studio, and we invited people to come and do a residency in the recording studio, and that was made possible by a cross-departmental collaboration. We've done similar things with the art gallery before. They did an event around Marcel Duchamp and his relationship with John Cage in the sort of 20th century American art world, and we took the opportunity to present like loads of bonkers electronic music in the art gallery during the course of that. And I've collaborated with the theatre, with people like The Knife or Ryoji Aikida or Scott Walker when they've come with projects that just don't work in a concert hall. I've gone to our theatre and said, look, you know, can we use the theatre? Do you want to co-promote, co-produce this cross-arts activity? And with the cinema as well, you know, I've done quite a lot of smaller works in our cinema with artists who want to do a film and music performances there. So Wolfgang Voigt, for example, there was a show that I saw here at Foxburner years and years ago, where he was doing kind of live video with his kind of amniotic techno stuff that we did in our cinema. That was amazing. And the final thing I would suggest, and this is probably get told this all the time in every single thing you ever attend, but you know, networking, it's like a really big deal. You know, you never know where a really great project's going to come from, and you never know where the kind of solution to a problem is going to come from. So, you know, I take meetings all the time, I make meetings all the time, I come to events like this, you know, and really the idea is to inject a bit of serendipity into my working life. You know, a moment of surprise or revelation can come out of almost any conversation. So I would just encourage you to just talk to people and see what happens. I did a talk a bit like this one a few months ago to a bunch of people who are interested in film and music, who were on I think it was a British Council trip to London, and I got out of the blue, I got a concert proposal from a woman who was in the audience for the talk that I did, who turned out to be a really interesting composer called Jessica Curry, who'd been doing a lot of work with video games. And so working with her now, next month, we're going to do a show where we do a live video game and soundtrack performance, which is something I've never done before. It was a really interesting idea to me. And that actually happened simply because this woman came and listened to me bollock on like I have been doing to you. And then I said, hey, if anyone has any ideas, let me know. And she did. So we're doing it. So anything can happen. So that's about as much as I was planning to say. If any of you have any questions, feel free. And if not, feel free.
I got a question. I'm wondering if you also support bands, and if so, what's important for you to support them?
Yeah, good question. The answer is that we do, of course, but we probably do, you know, not every show has a support. and that's for all kinds of reasons, but often it's just because it's conceived in a certain way. It's going to be a kind of body of work that we present in an evening, and it kind of arrives fully formed. But we do often present support bands, and it can be a kind of slightly tortuous process, because you have to kind of get buy-in from often. Well, some artists don't care, but hilariously, it's a true story. There you go. So I'm doing this show with Stars of the Lid, which is in about a month's time. I think, it's for 2nd of October? Yeah, about a month's time. Sorry, it's my colleague Sabine, by the way. That's why I keep looking over there. She does media relations at the Barbican. You can talk to her if you're interested in media relations at the Barbican. So Adam Wiltsey from Stars of the Lid said, I really want to think about support, and I suggested a few things to him. He was like, no, that's not quite the right thing, and then he disappeared, and I got an email from him yesterday actually, which I checked when I got off the plane. Oh, Chris, I've really dropped the ball on this support thing. Have you got any good ideas? I was just like, you fucker, you told me you were going to tell me, you were going to decide who you wanted, so now I'm kind of, sending him lists of ideas which he presumably won't look at, and then he'll tell me about a week before what he actually wants. So sometimes it can be a bit tortuous, and I don't always have a free hand. You have to go through an artist or their management or whoever to try and make it work. But sometimes it can be an amazing opportunity, and I do have a kind of list in my mind of people who I've encountered, emerging artists of whatever kind, who I would love to give an opportunity to when the right show arrives. So hopefully I have, when I'm in a situation where I have to make suggestions, I actually have a ready-made list of suggestions rather than thinking, where's Spotify?
Then a following question, so if you say that you don't actually really look for support bands, especially for some concerts, but you have a list in your mind which you collect kind of, would that mean that it's also useful, let's say, for bands to apply, although there's not really
It's not an application form, no.
Okay, so the bands you look for support bands don't really apply.
There's no kind of formal process. I mean, really, it's a. Obviously, I want whoever plays first in a show to be great and to fit in with to appeal to the audience for the main artist and all that kind of stuff. And because we present a really wide range of music, and often, over the course of an average year, maybe only a few things are even remotely similar, so there aren't that many opportunities, and it would be a bit disingenuous of me to say to an artist who contacted me, yes, as soon as an opportunity arises, I'll be in touch, because it may never arise. But I spend my life, who doesn't, but I spend my life on the internet listening to new music, and I don't just listen to established artists. In fact, I know about established artists, I'm trying to discover new work just like everyone else is. That's partially why I'm here this week. So I'm always interested to come across new stuff. I may not be able to do anything with it very soon, but I may. You never know. You just never know. So I do literally. You can ring up the Barbican, and people do, and just say, can I speak to somebody in music programming? And, my phone will ring, and like I say, I don't have anyone who there's no way for me to know who's ringing, so I pick up the phone, and quite often it's somebody on the other end saying, hi, I'm in a band, can I send you some music, And I always say, yeah, of course. But that doesn't mean I can guarantee anything. If I like something, I'll try and do it when the moment arises. Ticket prices, or
ticket prices, but the rent, for the promoter.
Okay, so obviously I work for the Barbican, so I don't pay a rent to use the venue. This is the magic of my job, is that I can use it for nothing. But if you're an outside promoter and you come in, there's a set charge, which is it's about 10 grand, about £10,000 for a day. But there are actually very few, because there's so much activity. There's the classical activity and the commercial activity and my activity and all the rest of it. There are probably only about 30 or 40 days a year which are set aside for commercial artistic rental, and about half of those go to classical projects anyway. So there are very few. I mean, people do come in and rent the room, and we're very happy for them to do it, but there's just not that many opportunities. And we have far more inquiries, even for Monday nights in January, than we can actually give to people. So it's a publicly published rate, and it's about I think it's, off the top of my head, it's like for a purely acoustic, non-technical performance, it's like £7,000, and then if you need the PA and the lights and all the rest of it, it's another 2 or 3 grand on top of that for a technical package. So it's about 10 grand.
So you do the whole promoting thing because you're looking at artists sometimes.
That's right, yeah.
So you do all the work.
I do all the work. I don't do any work.
I used to work for a small music venue in London, and they would never do anything by themselves. They would just rent everything out.
Yeah, no, we as an arts centre, you know, we need the programme to have a kind of identity, I suppose, and that's why we have, you know, people like me, programmers, or they're described as curators, or it depends on the art form what the title is, you know. But yeah, the job is to try and curate a programme, and we tend not to take rentals that we don't think are a good fit with the space. So we kind of quite often have when there's an inquiry, quite often there might be an informal conversation in the office where people go, oh, so-and-so wants to rent the hall to present this artist. What do we think of this artist? You know, and we'll go, yeah, they're all right. But the vast majority of if you take the year, the vast majority of performances are either presented by us as a Barbican own promotion, or by our residents, like the LSO, the orchestras, you know, who present between them probably 110 concerts a year or something like that. So if you add what the residents do and what we do, that's kind of 200 a year or something, just under probably.
While planning the program for the next year, would you say it's like very important to have like a connecting idea every year, like a concept for the year, or is it like the general Barbican spirit, which just like chooses interesting events and just loosely connects them with this philosophy of the location, or is it like that you every year plan like concept?
It's a really good question, and obviously some art centres really take that idea. I mean, in London, the South Bank Centre, which is the other big arts institution, is really big on overriding festivals. You know, they will always, everything is under a banner of something, you know. we deliberately don't really do that, because we want to be free to grab anything. It would be a real shame to turn down interesting projects because it doesn't fit your concept. But we do look out for, in a very loose and abstract ways, we do have programming ideas that are cross arts that we respond to. So, for example, there might be an art exhibition that's happening, and because exhibitions are typically there for 3 or 4 months or longer, and they're usually confirmed much longer in advance than the music program, they can be confirmed, you know, 3 years out, then quite often that will kind of, as it were, shade the atmosphere around the building in a certain way for a period of time that we can respond to. And occasionally we identify themes. So I mentioned the John Cale project earlier on. That actually came out of an exhibition called Digital Revolution that was taking place. And so we were all on the lookout for kind of, you know, interesting technologically enhanced projects. So the answer to your question is a bit of both. It's a combination of freedom and kind of loose ideas that we occasionally collectively kind of connect with. I think it would be really restrictive to say, next year, the music of Q8, I don't know.
Hi, you said you've done interdisciplinary stuff using the cinema and other sort of features of the venue. Have you done much with dance as well?
The answer is not that much, but yes, some. And more to come. The short answer is it's really not my field. I don't claim to know very much about modern dance, but I've definitely worked with artists who have collaborated with choreographers and for whom movement has been a part of the show. Sometimes that's been really urban-y type stuff, so the Just Jam project, I'm not sure if you were in the room, I mentioned earlier on, which was that kind of street music thing. We had kind of footwork dancers and stuff doing things during, throughout the performance. And then I've done more formally choreographed movement type stuff when that's been, and I have once or twice kind of commissioned choreographers to come up with some movement as part of a show because it felt like it was required. But actually, dance, which is typically done, as I'm sure you know, with pre-recorded rather than live music, is generally programmed by the theatre, in the theatre. That's just how it tends to work in the Barbican. So there is a dance programme. It's rarely me. Any more? Yeah, no, go ahead.
Still a question. I once talked to another programmer who told me that in his all programming, and he books different locations too and so on. So there he said that some pop bands and some pop concerts are filling the locations that way. Then he can also book some not that commercial and pop, let's say concerts or programs, whatever. And how's your thought about that? That you need some more some concerts who are filling the venue.
Yeah,
others are more interesting.
Obviously, I would love to sell out the venue every time that we do something, and quite often we do. But I would say that we're not a commercial entity, so profit is not the motive. I have to hit my income targets over the course of a year. I'm only allowed to spend a certain amount of money, and if I overspend, then I get into really big trouble and loads of annoying meetings with people from finance badgering me all the time about ticket sales. So there are lots of incentives for not just spending money freely, and I'm not against taking a profit. I mean, I quite often take profit on, I'll do a show with the express intention of making some money on it, and I'll construct the deal so that I'll make some money on it. But I am able to subsidise other things with that money. So it's not like when I don't hand the profit back to the Barbican and then carry on. It just affects the overall bottom line for my annual budget. So some shows contribute to the annual budget and some shows detract, So the need to do that entirely depends upon how much money I've spent elsewhere. So it's almost like a bit of a reverse. I tend not to book the money makers first. Quite often what happens is that I'll keep a few, in the UK, you may know the financial year ends at the end of March. So quite often I'll leave a few dates in February and March free, so that if at this time of year I'm looking at my budget and thinking, I'll try and book a couple of things for the end of the year that'll bring in a bit of extra money.
Yesterday evening there was a talk about German-English friendship, musician from East Germany and an English one. And I was wondering, did you ever book a German band? in the Barbican? Or is the audience, is it there for a German band? Would it be like the
I mean, I've certainly booked lots of German artists.
Right.
I mean, I mentioned Niels Fram earlier. Obviously, as far as I can tell, he's German. I have a really close relationship with a conductor actually called Andre de Ridder, who lives here in Berlin. And Andre, some of you may have come his work. He has a group called Stargaze. Some of them are German, some of them are Dutch. Who are kind of really interested in chamber ensemble. I've done stuff with them, doing work with like Matthew Herbert, and Julia Holter, and people like that. And I've done stuff with people like Michael Rother of Neu, and so the answer is yeah, but there isn't, in a weird kind of way, for example, this is just anecdotal, so it might be complete rubbish, but as far as I can tell, there's some mad statistic in terms of the number of French people who live in London. It's like London is like the third biggest French city or something like that. There's hundreds of thousands of French people live in London. And if you book somebody like, Juliette Greco or Jane Birkin, or who I know isn't French, but you know what I mean, then the French audience really turns out for those kind of artists. I don't get the sense that in the same way there's a German audience in London who will come out en masse to see a German artist. And so the stuff that I've done tends to be stuff that's crossed over to English kind of rock and pop listeners. So I'm working right now actually with Ermin Schmidt from Cannes, who is writing a book that's being published next year, and he and I are going to do an orchestral performance of music by Cannes that he's written orchestral arrangements for. So that's happening next spring. But obviously Cannes crossed over to an English audience in the way that other German bands might not have done. I'm clearly not an expert on German bands that haven't crossed over to an English audience. So the answer is it works. It works for some things, and I'm very happy to have any nationality at all in the program. In fact, I would say that bizarrely we book almost the nationality that's least well represented in the program is British. I mean, we do present international artists more than anything else. When I say international, I mean everywhere,
Yeah, of course.
How many of these acts do you find while you're actually traveling around? I mean, we talked about the Swedish jazz band that you discovered, and I was wondering, do you have something like a budget for traveling and finding artists, and how do you justify that? I mean, do you have to justify that? Because it's always a difficult question about.
It's our annual travel budget for our department is about £5,000. So compared to the amount that we're spending on other things, it's really very small. But with that money, you can do. I'll let you into a secret. I didn't pay to come here. Pop-Kultur paid me for my flights and my hotel. So, and I do get invited. It's one of the great privileges of my life is I get invited to things quite a lot. So I went to Montreal a couple of months ago for Mutech, and I didn't pay to go there, and I got invited to Seoul to go and see a thing in Korea last year, and I didn't pay to do that, and I got invited I'm going to Bogota in 2 weeks' time to a Colombian thing, and I'm not paying to do, or when I say I mean the Barbican. So I do get invited to things quite a lot. So my annual travel budget covers the things. Usually I actually spend it on things I've already commissioned, but I want to see that are happening somewhere else. So I mentioned the CTM collaboration. I think I paid to come to CTM back in February using the Barbican's travel budget because I'd commissioned this project and I wanted to see it before it came to London, so I knew what the hell I was getting myself into. It's a jolly good job I did as well, let me tell you. So it can be justified actually in terms of like really being super useful to be able to brief not just our technical team, but also our marketing and media relations people. If I've been to see something, it really helps them to be able to sit there and say, I've seen it, this is what it's like, go out and talk about it. Similarly, I might take a few snaps and take them back to the technical manager and say, okay, this was their setup on stage, this is their sound design, this is what they need to pull it off, can we do it in our space, So it can be justified in very practical ways that I've gone to see, and also, artistically, it's quite often a really bad idea to book something without having seen it. Sometimes, I do it sometimes, but but I try to have at least seen the artist do something before I book them. Otherwise, they turn up and you go, this is terrible.
Do you have experience in like cross arts and cross genre presentations or shows, like created connections between artists later on? For example, the how you call the show with the world music, trippy style music, like for example this, or like the gallery with musicians. Have you had experience that like these connections lasted?
Yeah, sometimes actually. Yeah. It's hard to kind of come up with a ton of examples, but there are quite a lot of people out there who I kind of treat of as kind of artistic partners. In other words, sometimes I've got a project that needs a conductor or an arranger or a particular musician, or it needs some audiovisual stuff, or it needs some programming or something. So I have a kind of pool of kind of, as it were, not kind of stars, front people, but kind of really useful collaborators who I know and quite often I've introduced them to people for a particular project and then they've gone off and worked together subsequently again. That happens quite a lot actually. And sometimes it feeds back into our program. So this example's a bit ancient, but ages ago I did a show about this American composer called Moondog, bonkers kind of street outsider composer. And one of the people who had worked with him towards the end of his life was a guy called Andy Thoma from Mouse on Mars, who lives here in Kreuzberg. I mean, I know we're not literally in Kreuzberg, but you know what I mean. So I got Andy over to come and do some pieces within that concert, and in the course of coming to do the pieces that he did, which was some late electronic pieces that this guy had written, Andy met Andre de Ridder, who I just mentioned, who's a conductor, and then Andre subsequently introduced Mouse on Mars to Cologne Philharmonie and Musikfabrik, who then commissioned them to write a orchestral piece of music, which then I subsequently, about 2 years later, presented at the Barbican. So these kind of chains of activity can happen. And so you end up with this big, slightly amorphous network of interesting people, which is the most fun thing about the job, really.
So like creating new art directions while connecting people in your program and really like influence the direction art is taking. Like, do you have a philosophy behind it? Like, do you have a plan, or is it just like connecting? Oh, interesting, let's do it, or is it?
I really see myself as a facilitator, not an influencer. So I identify artists who I think are interesting for whatever reason, and then I try and give them the support they need to do what they want. I'm not really trying to guide, I'm not an A&R person, I'm not trying to guide people in any particular direction. I just see, I'm not saying my judgment's right or accurate in any way at all, I'm sure it's completely mad, but there are artists who I find interesting, and I say, I really think you're interesting, let's try and do something. And sometimes that's a seed that can be planted and might not flower for 5 years. I might just, I got a phone call from somebody a few weeks ago who said, oh, you said to me if I ever wanted to do something, well, I've got this idea, and that happens, Yeah, sorry, I'm happy to stop. We need to stop? Yeah? Okay, well, that's it then. Thank you very much.